Thank you, Russell. Thank you, George. Thank you to all the sponsors and everybody for turning up today and for being here and for affording me the chance to talk to this crowd. Um, I'm going to focus my presentation, like my book, on not Bitcoin, unfortunately. But don't worry, there are a lot of people that are going to be talking to you about Bitcoin throughout the day. But the majority of my book doesn't really get into Bitcoin. It focuses on money and explaining money. And I think, as I was writing the economic introduction to a book on Bitcoin, I ended up just writing more and more and more about money that I felt was important to explain the history of what led us to get to Bitcoin. And so the first question that I'm going to begin with is, what is money? What do we mean by money? Well, money is just an easy way of saying a fancy term called medium of exchange. And that just means it's something that you buy not for its own sake, but you buy it for the sake of exchanging it for something else. That's it. That's what money particularly means. It's something that you don't buy because you want it itself, but because at some point you're going to sell it for something else. And so there's no strict definition of what can or can't be money. Anybody is free to use anything they want as money, and anybody can choose to accept it or not. And throughout history, many things have been used as money, but some things do the job much better than others, and that's a really important point. So some things are easy to make, and therefore, if you use them as money, you hold them. When you buy them, when you purchase more of them as money, their value goes up, and then it becomes attractive for the people who are able to make them, to make more of them. And then that will devalue the value of the quantity that you have. Is the audio okay, or is the mic fine? Yeah, okay. So on the other hand, some things are hard to make. It's hard to increase their supply. And these things tend to be much better as money because they hold on to their value better, because it's much harder for other people to pick them up, to make more of them and increase their supply. So essentially, over time, what ends up happening, through people realizing this or simply through just economic reality forcing itself, the things that are the hardest to make end up being used most as money, and the things that are easy to make end up not being used as money, or if they do get used as money, it doesn't last long because those things are not very, good at keeping value. As soon as people use them as money, their value goes up, more of them is made. So if we look throughout history, we look at the sort of things that have been used as money, we find that what they have in common at the period at which they were used as money was that they were hard to make. If something is hard to make, it's hard to increase the supply of it, it's going to get used as money. And so examples are things like cattle, limestones, rare seashells, glass beads, metals, precious metals. Government money sometimes even does the job. Cigarettes in prison can work as money because you can't make cigarettes in prison. So if something is hard to make, it can become money. And in fact, we see over time, throughout history, money tended to become the thing that was the hardest to make, which was gold. And that's why at the beginning of the 20th century, gold was money pretty much all over the world, because everybody else who used things other than gold as money, the value that they stored in those things collapsed. And so the wealth that was stored in them was reduced significantly compared to the people who used the harder money. And so effectively, really, the introduction of a medium of exchange and the ability of people to use something as a store of value, the effect that it has on people is that it lowers their time preference. And that's a fancy way of saying it makes them think about the future more. That's really the key thing one of the key things to understand about what money does to us. Before money, if you had something that was valuable, your choice was to consume it now or wait on it for as long as it will last. But with the introduction of money, you can take that valuable thing and decide you don't want to consume it now, you want to exchange it for something else, and then have that something else store that value for you for the future, where you can then consume it. And that just completely changes our ability to think of the future and provide for the future. That is just going to lead to us becoming more and more future-oriented. And so money is essential in the ability of people to become future-oriented and to drive themselves toward thinking more and more of the future. And if essentially the better the money is at holding on to its value, the more it's going to allow us to think of the future and provide for the future. And so this issue of time preference is enormously important, and I think it's really maybe the most important topic for me that interested me in Bitcoin in the first place was the idea of the effect of hard money on individual time preference. And it's something that I get into in detail in my book, and I would have loved to tell you that I have my book for sale, but the book shipment didn't get here. But you know, Amazon has it on discount, so you can just order it from Amazon for $10 or something. But the chapter 5 in the book, if you do get around to reading it, focuses on the issue of time preference. And as people begin to have more certainty about the future, because they can store value into the future, they start thinking more about it. And so you see that in periods and places in history where people had a money that was very hard and that was good at keeping its value, you see that people were very future-oriented, that people produced things of long-term value that had a lot of value for the future. Whereas on the other hand, you see that in periods where there's inflation of the money supply, where the money supply is easy to produce and the value of the money is constantly collapsing, people don't think a lot of the future. They can't think too much of the future, and so they move toward thinking more and more of the present. And so this really is, I think, the concept of time preference in economics is really one of the most important ideas in all of economics. In every class of economics I teach, I always make sure to include a discussion of the topic of time preference, because I think it's really important to understand it. Because you do a lot of trades in your life, you will trade with a lot of people all over your life, but you will never trade with anybody as much as you will trade with yourself, in particular your future self. Every moment of your life is essentially a moment where you're taking decisions, trading off you know, yourself today, trading off between yourself today and your future self. And this really is more important than any other kind of decision that anybody makes. As an economist, I find it absolutely fascinating to look at this aspect of individual decision making. If you think of the long term, then all of your decisions are focused with long-term benefits in mind, and all of your decisions are focused in terms of, you know, you want to make things better in the long term. In the long run, people who do that will find life much easier to live in the long term. Things will work out better for the long term. People who have a high time preference are more focused on the present, will take decisions that involve the present more, and will pay the consequences for them in the future. So an excellent example of this is something called the marshmallow study, where they got a bunch of children and they told them, you can have a marshmallow now, or if you can wait another 15 minutes or hour or whatever, you'll get 2 marshmallows. And so it was a test of the ability of children to delay gratification. And they found that that correlated highly with children's ability to succeed in all kinds of things, with children's ability to stay healthy, and you know, all sorts of indicators of success in later life were correlated to the ability of the children to delay gratification. And I think there's a very strong element of individual outcomes that is determined by this ability. And this, for me, is what is most fascinating about Bitcoin, because for about 100 years now, we haven't really had access to a proper medium of exchange that could hold its value really well. We haven't had a hard money since the gold standard was abandoned about 100 years ago in 1914. Before then, if you look at the world before 1914, and I get into this in detail in my book, you know, you find people had very high savings rates. You know, economic growth was high and stable. People would save a lot. Capital accumulation was happening. It was the most important period in human history, perhaps, in technological innovation. It's when we invented the car and the engines and all sorts of innovations, which I get into in detail. And all of that was happening at a period when the money was hard, when the money supply was very hard to increase. And all over the world, people were using gold as money. And I don't think that is a coincidence, because hard money incentivizes people to think more of the future, and then that encourages better decision making for the future. And I think it reflects individually and it reflects societally as well. And I think, you know, a lot of Bitcoiners, I'm sure there's a lot of Bitcoiners here, for the noobs, you know, talk to them and see their experience. A lot of them will report this story that, you know, once they started getting into Bitcoin, they start thinking about saving much more. Many people didn't save before. And if you look, in fact, at saving rates across the Western world over the last 50 years, they've been declining continuously people save less and less and less. As money has become less and less valuable over time, savings also decline. And I don't think that is a coincidence. And if you look, Switzerland was the last country to get off the gold standard in the 1970s, and they continue to have the highest savings rates of any country in the Western world because they remained on the gold standard. So, if you think about many of the problems of the world today, and this has become almost a running joke on Twitter, people on Twitter always, amongst Bitcoin Twitter, we're talking about how fiat money is really involved in a lot of these problems. And just the notion of money that loses value incentivizes short-term decision making. Everybody's in debt, everybody's consuming a lot, nobody saves. And that follows with, that entails all kinds of problems. But the good news, Bitcoin fixes this. And we're here today. We've assembled a world expert team of crack experts, top-notch experts who are going to tell you all about how Bitcoin fixes all of the kinds of problems that are caused by bad money. And essentially, by being hard money, Bitcoin gives people the ability to save their wealth into the future. Bitcoin gives people the ability to think further of the future, and gives people the ability, I think the other thing, other than the store of value, the other interesting thing is that it offers us the potential, if more and more people join it, we have the potential to essentially build a free market monetary system alternative to government central banks. If you think about it, sending money around the world is still largely run by central banks. There's really no alternative to sending money internationally except going through central banks until 2009 when Bitcoin came along and changed that. And so really it's quite interesting to imagine what would happen in an economy in which money was also provided by the free market. And most people think this is not possible. Most people study in the economics textbook where the existence of a central bank is taken for granted. There needs to be a central bank. But many countries didn't have central banks or had central banks that didn't issue money. The role of the central bank is probably not essential. It's just another form of central planning. And it affords the government an enormous privilege, an enormous exorbitant privilege, really, that allows them to spend an enormous amount of money, to have access to a lot of resources, to finance spending on war and all kinds of things, without really facing any serious consequences, without really facing any real consequences to their spending. And Bitcoin fixes this in a sense of it allows you to have the value of your money be determined by the market itself. There's nobody out there who's in charge of the money supply who can inflate it, who can increase the supply and bring down the value of the money, and so essentially take away the value that you've stored into that money and use it to finance things with which you do not agree. Bitcoin brings us back to a world with more individual sovereignty, since people could have more control over their own money, have more control over what they want to choose to spend their money on. And I think, if you understand the power of markets, if you've seen the transformation that happens to societies that went from centrally planned economies to free market economies, I think you'd see something similar with moving away from a monetary central planning system to a monetary free market system. That, for me, really is the main promise of Bitcoin and the most interesting aspect of it, or the most interesting aspects of it. The effect in terms of time preference, individual decision making, and the ability to build a world in which money is peaceful. Money it isn't controlled by state, isn't coercive, and is free to opt into by people. And I think this is a truly exciting time to be alive, to be watching this unfold. There's no guarantee that it will work. We should always, remind everybody. But I think there is it already is working. If you know how to use it, it already is working for you today. But we have a great cast of speakers today that are going to be talking about all of the many things that Bitcoin allows us to do. And yeah, thank you very much.